It's Charter Local Edition. My name is Brad Pomerance, coming to you from Washington, D.C. We are joined by Steve Daines. He is a member of the United States Senate representing the great state of Montana. Must be tough living in paradise, I'm sure.
It's hard to get on that plane each week to come back to Washington, D.C., I can tell you that.
It must be very hard, actually. But you're new to Washington in the Congress for One session.
Right.
Now you're a member of the U.S. Senate. Give us a sense of the different bodies.
Well, I made a transition. I was 28 years in the private sector before I got involved in politics. Served one term in the House. But when you're a member of the House from the state of Montana, you represent the entire state. Right. In fact, somebody said, why do you want to go from being one of one to being one of two in the Senate?
That's a good point. It is very funny when you think about it.
But it's been a great transition.
Right.
And the issues in Montana are the same in the Senate or the House. Of course. But the Senate's a smaller body. It's 100 members. And contrary to the beliefs, I think most would say, it's always one great big fight.
Right.
There really is, behind the scenes, good, strong, bipartisan discussions that go on with Republicans and Democrats.
Is it truly that way? Because we've always known and heard that the Senate has been a wonderful club. I don't mean that pejoratively. I mean truly a club. Whereas the House, it was, the raucous caucus, and there was a lot of chaos going on over there.
Yeah, well, I think there's it is called the great deliberative body, although I think sometimes you look, what are they deliberating about, for God's sake? Do something there. But I would say, generally, the relationship between the senators, they're positive, constructive, and part of that is because the Senate requires bipartisan solutions. It requires 60 votes to break through any kind of filibuster.
And I think about the great state of Montana, represented by one Democrat, one Republican in the United States Senate, correct?
Yeah, true. In fact, I was the first Republican elected to the seat in 101 years. And so growing up in Montana, Montanans elect Republicans, Montanans elect Democrats. You know what they want the most? They say, set aside the R or the D label, make sure MT's behind your name.
Nice.
And it's a reason why there's a Democrat and a Republican in the Senate from Montana.
And one of the biggest T's in MT is timber. So let's talk about timber.
Yeah.
Because, I think there's a lot of misperceptions about timber, the importance of timber, how there is conservation of timber, yet appropriate use of timber. What can you tell us, for those of us not from Montana, about the timber industry?
Well, I remember when I was a kid growing up, we had 30 active sawmills in Montana.
Right.
Today we have 11. One thing that we know for certain is a managed forest is a healthier forest.
It's interesting you say that, because I had spoken with some folks and they were talking about the Smokey the Bear campaign. Mm. And while intuitively that campaign seems wise, there is an argument that sometimes we should let it burn, because now we have some other challenges as a result of the Smokey the Bear campaign.
Well, here's what we need to do, though, is we need to actively manage our forests. They're healthier. Anybody who's ever had a garden knows you got to prune it, you have to thin them. The same thing is true of our forests. Today we have beetles that are going in and killing our forests. The trees are dead. We can't even cut down a dead tree. What happens is it builds up the fuel. We have wildfires. It destroys then the watersheds, because when these forest fires burn, it harms the wildlife, it harms the watershed, and so we need to responsibly manage our forests through timber harvest.
And there is confusion about that.
Well, there is.
Because when you think about management, does management mean cutting down? Well, it can.
Well, it does, and in fact, it's about the jobs as well. You go to some of these small counties up in northwest Montana, they are dying on the vine because they've lost their job base. When you're surrounded by national forests, it's a wonderful thing for hunting and for fishing, but there's no tax base there because the federal government doesn't pay taxes. So how do you generate revenues for your schools, for your teachers, for your communities? It's through responsible timber management on these national forests.
And let's talk more about timber, because like you said, the number of timber mills and timber jobs, they have been plummeting. And what some folks are saying is as a result of predatory lawsuits. It's complicated, but it's important to discuss.
Yeah.
What can you tell us about this?
We've had multiple hearings in Washington. I've had multiple meetings in Montana. And when it comes down to what the number one issue is, it becomes these obstructionists, these fringe groups that are litigating virtually every timber sale now in Montana.
And explain how that works, because for those of us not from Montana, it seems odd that you could sue to prevent a timber sale.
Yeah.
What are they saying?
They'll have some challenge in the process. They'll file a lawsuit. and it stops the ability for these timber companies, these small operators oftentimes to harvest. And oftentimes these are smaller operations, smaller law mills. They don't have great big teams of lawyers. They're small businesses in Montana who are trying to continue a profession that's been going on for generations back home.
So what can be done to create a scenario whereby we are protecting the ability of the timberman and woman to harvest, but at the same time allowing for appropriate litigation to move forward?
Yeah, this in no way suggests that we shouldn't have the ability to challenge.
Right.
What it says, though, is that the purposes of much of this litigation is just to stop, is to be obstructionist on it.
Right.
So there's ways to look at bonding provisions to make sure you've got skin in the game ahead of time.
And I understand that is being considered by
It's
the
part
Senate
of-
and the House.
Correct. You know, arbitration is another thing to look at as well. But the bottom line is this: a forest is healthier when it's managed. It's good for the environment. It's also good for our communities.
I want to talk about the forest because you mentioned this. There is dead timber throughout the Rockies, the upper Pacific Northwest, and a lot of it's because of this infestation. And there's a lot of consternation about why is this happening. Is it because of warmer climates? Is it because of a lack of management like you describe? What can you tell us?
Well, there's multiple factors, and again, we've had multiple hearings looking at this.
Right.
You know, part of it as well is that when you have the trees that start growing very, very close together, because there is no thinning and proper timber management practices, you know, the transmission of beetles, it increases because they're closer together.
Right.
The bottom line is this: we shouldn't have to be breathing the smoke from wildfires that burn in the summertime. Why not responsibly manage the timber, create the jobs, reduce the risk to the watersheds from these large forest fires, as well as what it does to the environment when you have these massive wildfires.
So who's responsible to responsibly manage? Is it the counties, the state of Montana, the federal government, all the above, none of the above?
Well, frankly, if you look in my home state of Montana,
Yes.
we are doing a good job of managing private land. Oftentimes our state forests are in pretty good shape. The problem is our federal lands, the federal forests.
Right.
And that's because we're seeing these lawsuits that go into our federal courts, and that's where it gets stopped. In fact, I have some dramatic pictures back in my office.
Which you'll give us, hopefully.
A green, vibrant forest on one side of the fence and a dying gray, sick forest on the other side of the fence. And the contrast is one is a national forest, the other is private land. You see the difference.
It seems as if I look at Democratic Senator Tester, I look at Republican Senator Daines, I look at Republican Congressman Zinks. You're all on the same page on this.
Yeah.
So if all three of you are on the same page, can't y'all talk to the federal government and say, this is what we want? We're the representatives of this state. We're Democrats and Republicans.
Yeah, well, in fact, in Montana, we spent many, many hours sitting around the table with conservation groups, with the timber industry, with sawmill operators, with county officials who need the jobs and the tax revenues. There's tremendous agreement. Something has to get done. We need to break this log jam.
Right, if you can use that cliche.
Correct. Right. And to start moving back to responsible timber harvests that will create the jobs as well as make for a healthier forest.
How close are we to that?
Well, I think we're going to see some legislation moving forward here sometime before the end of the year.
Do you have a sense, I apologize, that the President will be on board, the Department of Interior will be on board, the Forest Service will be on board?
Well, you know, what the good news is we've got the Forest Service here behind what we're trying to do. They say it's time to reform what's going on. We've got to break these obstructionist lawsuits. We need to move forward here with responsible timber harvest. So we got the Forest Service behind us. I think it's going to be some good tailwind here to get something done.
His name is Steve Daines. He is a member of the United States Senate representing the beautiful state of Montana. My name is Brad Pomerance. We are coming to you from Washington, D.C. It's Charter Local Edition.